Friend to this session of mediator pattern. In this session, we will try to understand the fundamental of mediator pattern. We'll go through a definition of it, and also we'll try to see a practical implementation of mediator pattern. So first thing, it's a type of behavioral pattern. Now let's understand that why do we exactly need mediator pattern. Many times, many times, no, always I'll say rather, not many times, always in projects we have components, and there is a heavy interaction between these components. Now what happens is the interaction between these components, if suppose they're very much high, means let's say that you have two or three components and they exchange messages with each other, and depending on the messages exchange, the other component gets affected, or I can say a group of component gets affected, then the logic can become complicated and the components become very complex. So if suppose you want to simplify this communication between these components, there is where uh, mediator pattern comes to use. So it helps the objects to communicate in a very dissociated manner, okay, means completely in a decoupled manner, and thus minimizing the communication complexity and making the component more simple. So you can say that mediator is like a traffic police. So you have component 1, component 2, component 3 in your project. All these components, if they want to interact with each other, they will first send the message to the mediator, and the mediator will then decide how the other components will get affected. For instance, you have an order component, you have a payment component, and you have a product component. So you want to say that the order component first checks for the payment, and depending on the payment, it goes and or books a product or orders a product. So these, rather than these three objects or these three components speaking with each other directly, what they do is that they send their events to a mediator, and the mediator then decides where to go. So your communication logic is completely written inside the mediator, and thus minimizing the complexity of communication. Because if these communication logic is written in the component itself, then definitely these components are very heavily tied up. So if you want to change one component, you also have to change the other component, because even the communication logic is now inside the component. So what we do is that what we do in mediator pattern basically is we move this communication logic to the mediator. Let's understand that with a simple example. We have a simple screen here. It has basically four main objects. One is a text box which takes in the name value, a add button, a clear button, and a list box object. So here are specific things which happen, when you work with one of the objects, how the other objects are affected. The first scenario, if you type something in the name, right, you want that the add button should be enabled, right, and the clear button should be enabled. If you don't type anything, then you just disable both these buttons. So that means that in the text change event of the name, the add button and the clear button is enabled. Good. Now second scenario, if you click the add button, right, it should clear the text box, it should disable the add button, it should disable the clear button. So again, depending on what the depending on, so on the event of clicking on the add button, three objects are getting affected. If I click the clear button, the third scenario, I should clear the text box name, clear the text box name, clear the disable the add button, and disable the clear button. Again, three components are affected. So what's happening is that whenever, from these four components, whenever there is some kind of event in the four component, the other three components are getting affected. Now rather than writing this communication between this component into one area, right, into the component itself, what we do is that we basically move them into a separate mediator logic. If you look at how the complication will look like, is something like this. Every component interacting with each other directly, and they are also taking the responsibility of how the communication will take place. Components should do the validation of business logic. They should not take up more responsibilities like UI logic or communication logic and etc. So the best way is that we put a nice traffic police in between the mediator. So if the text box is changing, if there's a text change event in the name text box, it will send to the mediator, I'm doing a text change event, please go and enable the add and the clear button. So mediator will take the message and send accordingly. If the add button is clicked, it will again send the message to mediator, and mediator will then see what to do on the add click of the button with the text box and the list box and the clear button. So the mediator has now the communication logic. How can this be implemented? Here's our mediator class. So it has basically all the references of all the four objects whose communications need whose interaction needs to be defined. Okay, so when you actually when the actually you create object of the mediator, first you need to register all these objects in the mediator class. So you register the text box, the list box, everybody in it, so that the mediator can, because if the mediator doesn't have a reference of these objects, he cannot do the communication. Now when there is, now let's look at what we discussed scenario wise. So if the first scenario we say the text change, if the text change event happens, the mediator says, okay, I will go and enable both of these objects to true. If there is nothing in the text box, I'll disable to false. Second scenario, if the button add click happens, I'll add the value to the list box and disable and clear the buttons and the text box. If the click button event happens on the clear button, then I will do the following things. So what's happening is that all this logic, all these scenarios are now being put inside the mediator class. Thus, we have removed the communication logic or the complicated communication from the UI. So UI now will look very simple. On the constructor or the initialize of the form of the event, initialize of the form, we just add all the components to the mediator, so the mediator is aware of all the UI components. Now if you see in the text change, I just say to the mediator, please, there's a text change event, and he will take care which components to enable, which objects to enable. In the mediator, I say, please, it's a add button click. The mediator will then go ahead and interact with other objects accordingly. So you can see that in the UI now there is only one line of code, and all the communication is shifted to the mediator class. If you look at the sample code of it, here's the CLS mediator. So you can see that all the four objects which were discussed and the events, and if you look at the form, when the form constructor is initialized, we first add all the four objects to the mediator, so the mediator is aware of these four objects, and then call the appropriate event of the mediator depending on which object is operated, or which, like if there is a button clear click, we call the click clear event. If it's a button add click, we call the mediator's click add button event. So now if you see, the client logic has become pretty simple. You don't see a lot of enable and disables. All the logic is now shifted to mediator, and mediator handles this all requests centrally. So now let's look at how our class will look like, or how our operations will actually happen, or how the UI will function. So once I type something in, you see that it is enabled. If I delete something, it is disabled. If I add it, clear is for the text box is cleared and the clear is enabled. So these all interaction between the objects are now been taken care by the mediator class, or it has been centralized in the mediator class. So that was a code walkthrough. I'm sure that we were able to explain you how mediator pattern helps. Uh, Mediator pattern is definitely one of the very important fundamentals or very important design patterns, because all of our projects have object interactions, all of our projects have heavy object communications, and mediator pattern is a way to go where you can centralize these communications, the communication between the object into one mediator class, or a centralized mediator class, and uh, minimize your component complexity. If you see the source code, you will come to know that how the UI was so clean, and all the interactions of the components were centralized in the mediator class. So a very important pattern. Always remember, the question you should ask yourself is, are my communication between the components very complex? Change in one component, is it leading to a lot of changes in other components, or triggering some kind of events in other components? Is there a heavy communication? Yes. If the answer is yes, then put in a mediator class in between, centralize all this communication logic in the mediator class, and simplify your component logic.